Okay, well, it is 7 o'clock Oslo time now. And so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So any latecomers can sneak into the back of the room as they're used to. So welcome everyone to this webinar on moving knowledge, transmission, genealogies, and disruptions. This is part of a series of webinars under the auspices of the Books Known Only by Title project at the Center for Advanced Studies at the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters in Oslo. My name is Matthew Munger, and I am Associate Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Literatures at MF Norwegian School of Theology, Religion, and Society in Oslo, Norway. I'll be leading this evening's discussion. Joining me tonight, we have a couple of scholars whom I am sure you all know who are, that work with texts and the transmission of knowledge in early Jewish and Christian contexts. And so I'm joined here by Dr. Ellen Muehlberger, Dr. Blossom Stefaniw, and Dr. Jacqueline Vayntrub. And of course, Dr. Esther Brown-Smith is here with us as well, and she is going to be taking care of the technical side as well as helping us with question and answers. So Esther is going to give us a bit of information about how the Q&A will work and how technical things will function before we move on with the panel. So Esther.
Okay. So this is a webinar format, which most of you may be familiar with, but in case you aren't, it means that we can't see or hear you. So the way to interact if you are an attendee is through, you can enter the chat, and I will be keeping an eye on that. But if you have a question for the panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit that question, and we'll make sure to get to it in turn. So chat is for informal discussion, but if you have a question, use the Q&A. If you're in the chat, just note the difference between sending a chat to all panelists versus panelists and attendees, because if you choose the former, then the other attendees will not see you. And if you have any tech support questions or issues, you can either message me or email me. I just put my email address in the chat. And last but not least, we are streaming this live on Facebook. So if you want to share this panel with your friends, you can click on the link there and share it on Facebook and have them watch with you. And that's all I have to say.
All right, thanks a lot, Esther. So now let's get right into the business of the evening. So when we think about the way in which knowledge is transmitted, there are a number of key metaphors and ideas that come to mind. Books are often conceived as a manner of transporting knowledge, and they certainly are in reality as well. In antiquity, scribes often compared the knowledge that they transmitted in their books as cargo, and this can be seen in a number of widely attested traditions within colophons in Syriac, Greek, and Latin manuscripts, where the scribe compares himself to a sailor and the book to a boat. And writes something like, as the sailor rejoices to reach his harbor, so the scribe rejoices at the last line that he writes, and things like that. And in ancient literature, the transmission of knowledge is depicted also in a variety of ways, through divine speech, through revelation, through other human speeches, and often also through the transmission of books. So the Book of Jubilees, for example, is introduced to the reader as being not only a book, but as being the book, that is, as being the stone tablets that are mentioned in Exodus 24:12, when God says to Moses, "Come up to the mountain and wait there, and I will give you tablets of stone with the law and the commandments which I have written." So in other words, the books that is known as the Book of Jubilees presents itself to be the book that is basically only known by title in Exodus 24. And thus that expression is found already in Second Temple Judaism. So in our panel this evening, we have a number of experts that will be discussing examples such as these, where knowledge is seen as moving through time and space in different ways, and the ways in which this is conceived in narratives and in texts. So we'll be looking at a number of examples from very well-known texts. I'm sure you will be familiar with the material that we're working with. And without further ado, let's move to our first presenter. First up is Dr. Ellen Muehlberger, professor of history and Middle East studies at the University of Michigan. Tonight, she will be presenting on the way in which early Christians took earlier writers in their tradition as authorities and knew their views through their dossiers of work. Yet their dossiers and these dossiers of late ancient Christians were notoriously spongy, liable to include pseudonymous and invented text. And so our talk tonight will focus on disruptions that happen with misattribution, pseudonymity, which were both rife in late ancient bookkeeping. Ellen, thank you very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me, and a big thank you to both Liv and Esther for inviting me. This is a delightful panel to be a part of, and thank you all of the attendees. We can see, if not your pictures, so I'm like, hello everyone. It's very nice to see everyone. Tonight, I'd like to talk about the 6th century, when Justinian the emperor decided that he had a bone to pick. He was invested in the continuity of Christian tradition and the conformity of Christian thought. Yet among those he ruled, there was neither conformity nor continuity. A century after the supposedly decisive Council of Chalcedon, Christian writers and thinkers continued to take issue with the council's rulings and to argue about its meanings. One of the central problems was whether the council had gone too far in its compromises, or if we put it in the framework embraced by most of the people in the discussion, had the council reverted to a theology that had already been condemned, namely that of Nestorius? Of course, the supporters of the council thought it clear that it had not actually made that mistake. Many did not see it so clearly. Justinian, in order to clarify, called a new council to be held in 553 CE, at which the community would come to a consensus condemnation of 3 things: a letter by one man, some texts by another man, and a third man, namely himself and everything he had written. If you spent some time learning the chronology of early Christian theology, you'll recognize in my short sketch the 3 chapters controversy. I raise it here because it demonstrates one of the oddest features of late ancient Christian culture. Men, their words, and their texts are a fuzzy, though unified, ontological entity. Each one stands in for the other, and the most corruptible of these, the man himself, is in fact unbounded by death or by time. He is able to be present at any era or place through his other, forgive me, hypostasies. The fuzziness is visible in the language about the 3 chapters controversy. That English moniker, the 3 chapters, calls up for us images of texts. You know, chapters are sections of books or a chapter in history. And the moniker works as long as you're thinking about 2/3 of the controversy. So there's a text from the Syrian writer Ebus of Edessa that was a problem. There's a few texts from Theodoret of Cyrus that were a problem. But the 3rd part of the controversy was simply a man, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and by extension his writings, but the council was charged with condemning him. That condemnation led to the loss of a number of titles that Theodore had written, or at least partial loss. And as an aside, I'll say here that if you're interested in Theodore of Mopsuestia, you'll be excited to know that Mark Del Cogliano and I are publishing a translation of all of the surviving fragments of his treatise on the Incarnation. This is coming out in a new volume of Christological writings and translations from the Cambridge edition of Early Christian Writings. So the moniker, the 3 chapters controversy, in English papers over a confusing state of things. Because in late antiquity, a man was a chapter in a certain sense. Because, for example, in Greek, the 3 chapters, the label is clearer by dint of being less precise. Kephalaia, yes, is a chapter, sure. It's a section of a book, it's a heading. But it's also a head, and it also refers to human beings, an author, a source, a fount of ideas, or a vessel holding the stream of tradition, or to go back to Matthew's introduction, the ship that provides the cargo. That odd feature that a man and a chapter, or a man, his words and his texts are the same, is odd, but is also entirely naturalized in early Christianity. and frankly, in some parts of its modern study. That feature bears directly on our question today because knowledge is transmitted through a combination of men, their words, and their independent of their words. Their dossier of works can stand in for them separately, a concept that ancient authors actually took advantage of by organizing their own works according to how they would like to appear. Of course, ancient authors also worried about false appearances or false attributions, whether of works to them that they didn't write or their works to others who didn't write them. False attribution was everywhere, and the problems that led to the 3 chapters controversy that I described at the start of this little piece could be traced to Cyril of Alexandria relying on the authority of a text that he thought had been written by Athanasius, his predecessor. But the text was in fact written by supporters of a position that both Cyril and Athanasius would have railed against. That is, the chaos that came through misattribution or through misrecognized authorship came because we relied, or they relied, on the assumption that words that issued from an authoritative man must be correct and must logically cohere with other representations of his person, him, or his other texts. Now, the method of evaluating texts in late ancient Christianity assumed the coherence of this ontological trinity, the man, his word, and his texts. Tom has written extensively about how early Christians conceptualized the writers who preceded them as the fathers, knowledgeable and knowable people from the past whose writings represented them, literally represented them immediately in the present. As Grauman points out, the ancient process of evaluating whether a text belongs in a certain man's dossier or not is based on the process of identifying a person by behavior that is germane to him. It proceeds, Grauman explains, on the logic of prosopopoeia, the characterization in speech that is takes as its highest aim the accurate representation of the or accurate conformity with the prior expectations of the person being characterized. That is, a text could be attributed to an author when it sounded like that author. But how do you know what an author sounds like? An existing dossier gives you that sense, and then that sense is what a new work must have squared with in order to join the dossier. In this way, actually, ancient Christian culture produced more lost titles in that evaluating just by consistency with an existing characterization ruled out surprising texts or surprising topics. A fair practice. I mean, how else are you going to judge whether a text belongs to Athanasius or not? But let's all recognize that using consistency as the criterion for attribution prioritizes the production of, well, consistency rather than the production of accuracy or comprehensiveness. The standard of consistency with prior expectations about the person and what he might say or think also brought new texts into being. So dossiers took on lives of their own, as in the case when later writers began to produce new words for already dead men, placing those dead men in dialogue with one another or placing them in the context of contemporary issues. Robin Whelan's recent book, this is Being Christian in Vandal Africa, I think it's 2018, it might be 2019, is a goldmine about this kind of practice of inventing dialogues for people who are long gone. At the same time, the lack of a dossier can mean the lack of a person. Alongside the books known only by title, we might have been able to run a project, Men Known Only by Name. There are many, many men who are mentioned in their friends' letters or are mentioned in other texts, are cited in lists of authors, sometimes right besides the titles of their books that are also known only by title. And we as scholars labor to help round those people out into living, writing persons who have biographies and development over the time of their careers. The emphasis in that sentence should land on the word labor, because it is a lot of work. As I wrote about in a short essay that I published at Marginalia Review of Books in 2015, our archival apparatus is structured so as to capture works by the name of their authors. And that way, unattributed works either get attributed very quickly, whether correctly or not, or remain mostly unknown and mostly unread. Or they get misattributed, with some authors like John Chrysostom acting like dense neutron stars who sort of pull in all the little pieces that are making orbit around them further and further until they just join the major planet or the star. And the labor to extract those pieces is immense. Annette von Stockhausen, who's here, I see, is captaining a project to edit the homilies of a 4th century opponent of John Chrysostom, Severian of Gabala. And she's working in Armenian as a start because the Greek tradition is just so unbelievably unruly. Ironically, some of this man's work, or what might have been this man's work, has been attributed to a more fully fleshed out author, namely his opponent, John Chrysostom. So von Stockhausen has her work cut out for her because of the system that we have that says authors must have words and their texts, if we're going to attribute them, must cohere with what we already know of them. Thus, the entity, or the fuzzy entity of the man, his words, and his texts governs not just late ancient literary culture and the knowledge that it transmits, but also our understanding and our reception of that culture and whatever knowledge we may draw from it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. I love the concept of the man, his words, and his text. I think that should be a title of a book, actually, if it isn't already. But what I was wondering is, do you think that the late ancient writers knew about the force of the dossier, and if so, what did they do to manage this the unruly nature of it?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you have to look at something like Augustine's retractions to know. I think men who were prolific and men who were trained in rhetoric knew that they would be received through their dossiers, both as living being. I'm a living human being and I have this set of works out here and people are going to judge me based on it. So I have to make sure that they're correctly attributed to me, or that things that I have not said have not been attributed to me. That was a source of anxiety, and you can see it in different people's letters, but also in the efforts like the retractions. You think a man who really just wants everybody to read what he's written exactly as he wants it read. And, scholars can make a lot of hay, especially in cases like make a lot of hay by just reading him against his own will.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, but we'll get to questions for all of the panelists once we've finished all 3 presentations. So again, thank you so much. We'll move on to our second panelist, who is Dr. Blossom Stefaniw. She is with us tonight from Oslo. She is a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies here, working on the Books Known Only by Title project, but she's also Heisenberg Fellow of the German Research Foundation, and she works on early Christian textual cultures, masculinity, feminist historiography of late antiquity. But tonight she's going to be discussing a couple of examples of knowledge transmission from the Hebrew Bible. So Blossom, thanks so much for being here with us, and take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I'm excited to, already hearing one of the 3 talks, I'm excited to see how this all connects. And I have to say that I have no expertise in the Hebrew Bible. This is just reading as English literature. That's as close as I get. And also the only purpose is to think about a couple of examples of books known only by title. So basically what I want to do today is to make a little bit of a bridge between my previous work on Christian reading and what this project is about at CAS in Oslo, the phenomena of books known only by title. So for tonight's purposes, I want to think about how a book known only by title is a way of moving knowledge, even though it's very paradoxical and ambivalent, because since it is known only by title, there's no book that goes with the title. You can't actually receive that knowledge, right? It's moving it, but it's not giving it over. So that kind of ambivalence and some of the dynamics we've been thinking about in the project so far suggest to me that some of the notions of displacement, genealogy, and curation which I got interested in the process of writing the Christian reading book, might kind of be of interest here. So in my comment today, I just want to explore a little bit about what happens if we imagine books known only by title as a way to move knowledge. Is that movement disruptive or conservative? Are they hiding knowledge? Are they sharing it? How can we describe that? And where does it go? You know, where do they put it, and what can readers do with it, since we can't actually just have it and receive it? So one thing that you cannot do with a book known only by title is find out what it contains. The author who mentions the book, which is to say the author of the text which contains the title, tends to suggest what sort of thing is in it. But since the book is fictional, you can't have that knowledge. So the pleasure of reading, of examining, of absorbing, and kind of running alongside with a narrative until you know what that piece of the world is like is just deferred forever. So this is curation without possession. It's a gift we can kind of have but not have. All we get is a mention or a title within a different text. And that's not what a title is supposed to do, right? The title itself is displaced. It's moved into a different position than it's supposed to have. It's not at the top of a text kind of announcing the name or the content of that text. It's more like it's being smuggled through time inside of some other story because it's not paired up with an extant text. So a book known only by title has departed from the proper textual order, and so is an instance of disruption in and of itself. So for tonight, just since they are stories that are maybe familiar to the most people, I wanted to look at a pair of books known only by title which appear in biblical texts, even though I have no expertise in the Hebrew Bible, okay? Now, the first thing I get curious about there is what's going on when we have a canon, a set of books which is supposed to describe a totality, which is supposed to tell us everything we need. What do we do with a canon which is kind of riddled with books known only by title in the first place, right? These are books which are recalcitrant, which are hidden, which are kind of easy to miss in the course of a narrative, but then are absolutely everywhere once you start looking. So I chose two examples which are based on the same formula, and I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see these examples. And with some luck, this will work correctly without inadvertently sharing things I do not want to share. Let's see here. I lost the whole screen for a second there. Sorry about that. All right. It's not giving me the choice I want. This is not working, is it?
Yeah, we see your screen.
Okay. Will you see my screen if I go back to looking at my notes? That's the question.
No.
Okay, then we're good to go. Right. Okay.
So now we see your notes, sorry.
Okay, yeah, it didn't give me the choice of different tabs to see. Okay, we're going to first look at the passages and then go back. Here's a draft of something I'm working on for everyone. Okay, so let's just look at these and then I will unshare and be able to talk about it like that. So we have two passages which follow the same formula. We have one from First Chronicles, which kind of signs off on the story about King David. And it says, as for the events of King David's reign, from beginning to end, they are written in the records of Samuel the seer, the records of Nathan the prophet, and the records of Gad the seer. So that's actually 3 books known only by title, together with the details of his reign and power and the circumstances that surrounded him and Israel and the kingdoms of all the other lands. Okay? Same formula appears in 1 Kings 11, signing off on the story about the death of Solomon. So the account of his reign is finished, and it says almost completely in parallel, as for the other events of Solomon's reign, all he did and the wisdom he displayed, are they not written in the books of the annals of Solomon? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. Then he rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David his father, and Rehoboam his son succeeded him as king. Okay, so we have 2 instances of books known only by title, which both appear in these sort of closure formulas where the author is announcing that they are now finished giving an account of a king of Israel. So let's look at this first one a little more closely. This is a sign off, it's a closing, but it's also not closing. It's saying, I'm finished telling you this, but there is more. There is more, but it is contained in these books, and I can name those for you. So in the David example, we see involvement with chronography, which is to say the orientation of the community to time. The events of David's reign are written from beginning to end. So there is a discrete section of time which is accounted for. And in that sense, it is linear. There's a line which starts at one point and ends at the other. But this everything is contained in 3 different books. Those books are not annals or chronicles. They are records of prophets and seers. So the things that should be complete and linear is sort of vaulted into another world, the one which is only accessible to prophets and seers. It's a realm beyond the mundane realm where a king's reign begins here and ends here. This means more displacement, a sort of expansiveness. We thought King David's reign began in this world and ended in this world, but if only seers and prophets know and have written anything about it, then that suggests that it has a greater sort of scope. So it's so complete and so expansive that it has bulged into the realm of revelation. And that is a way of breaking linearity and protecting knowledge from finitude. This is knowledge that can go on forever and go on into the metaphysical realm, if you will. So letting the account of David's reign overflow into 3 other unknown books means it will never only be in the past. So in my book on Christian reading, I had worked with the concept of the curator as sort of this switchboard, if you will, between the past and the future. Someone who is filtering out what is no longer needed from the past in order to equip people for a certain imagined future. And that's not what we're seeing here. That's not the mode of curation that we're seeing with these books known only by title and the way they move knowledge. What we see here instead is also curation, but it's curation of a very different type. It's managing and arranging inherited knowledge, but it does so by breaking out of this linearity. The knowledge is not just sort of ferried down from the past into the future. Here we have a curator who who preserves and protects and glorifies the knowledge of the reign of David by causing a flood. It's a project of displacement with saturation. The books which contain everything really might be anywhere. So there's also another element of disrupted genealogy here. These seers have a pedigree. They're, Samuel, Nathan, and God. They're all associated with David, but they are not his sons who have kind of passed down his writings. They're not fathers or elders. They're all contemporaries with him who mediated between him and God. So his counselors, not his fathers or sons, hold the knowledge of his reign. Suggesting, I think, that knowledge exists kind of somewhere in the current of exchange between the king and God. So let's look quickly at the formula as it applies to Solomon. This is also a curatorial moment, but there is not that same flooding and saturation which we see in the books of the seers. This account is tidy. It's so tidy that the account of Solomon's reign can be affirmed through a rhetorical question. Of course, they are written in the books of the Annals of Solomon. Where else would they be, right? So knowledge of Solomon's reign goes right into the annals where it belongs, and his body goes into the tomb with his ancestors where it belongs. Everything moves forward nicely and in an orderly manner through time, with his son Rehoboam succeeding him as king. The books of the seers say there's more, there's everything, it could be anywhere. But this book, known only by title, says everything is proper and reasonable. This is exactly what there is, and it is all in the right place. So this is an assertion of non-displacement, even in an account of a king whose kingship arose because of disrupted lineage. His brother died in battle against their father. His other brother, fictional or not, was taken as punishment for his father's adultery. So Solomon's own lineage, traditionally in its reception history, has migrated and been displaced to Ethiopia and to the Caribbean, and is still imagined and reimagined today. So a book known only by title, even when it's mustered within the same formula for finishing off a story about a king, can move knowledge in very different ways, whether displacing it or containing it, allowing it to overflow and flood out everything, or just buttoning it into its proper place to resolve an obscure proliferation. In both our cases here, it suggests what sort of thing we could know, the quality of knowledge that we could have about these kings. It suggests how excessive or how precise their worlds were, and it requires us to blend knowledge and imagination in finding our own place as inheritors of someone else's past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blossom. That was very, very interesting and a great perspective on the books known only by title, and the perspective of David and Solomon with being so kind of conceptualized so differently with what these books are doing. I was just wondering if you think that this idea of the curator playing on these conceptions of time. I mean, you're implying that they're moving away from a linear model, or your reading is moving away from a linear model of time by referring to the seers and these books in this way. But do you think the curator or the use of this curation technique is purposeful? Do you think that this is something that can be read as something that's creating already in that time an idea of the otherly, or is this something that we're just conceptually working with backwards as scholars?
Well, I'm not totally sure about that, but I think the important thing about conceptualizing creation is to make sure that we don't imagine the curator as sort of an innocent receiver, right? He's rearranging that for the future, but he's also rearranging the past. right? He's just not taking on the past wholesale and then maybe sorting a little bit. He's also doing retroactive work, not just work for the future.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and I'm sure there'll be questions also in the Q&A coming up. So we'll move on to our third and final panelist, who is Dr. Jacqueline Vayntrub from Yale Divinity School, where she is assistant professor of Hebrew Bible. Tonight, Jacqueline will be speaking about how biblical and ancient West Semitic narratives conceptualize the passage of things, words, and ideas from one person to another. And specifically, she will be looking at 3 different narratives where transmission goes wrong to draw out the ideas of truth, reliability of speech, and obedience. So Jacqueline, this sounds incredibly exciting, and we're looking forward to it. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen here. So I'm going to begin with this illustration, just to start on my remarks on transmission in biblical literature. So this illustration depicts the main characters in the drama of Genesis 27, Esau and Isaac, the paterfamilias and the firstborn and heir on the left, and Jacob, Rebekah and Jacob, the mother with the secondborn son on the right. The story in Genesis 27 is a drama of subverted convention and upended hierarchy that shows us how so-called reliable transmission in this literary culture depends on an idea of hierarchy and obedience. But in this story, everything goes wrong. The firstborn son does not receive the father's blessing, which is a transmission of authority, and the father's commands to his firstborn son are undermined by the mother's commands to the secondborn son. So Isaac, who's about to die, commands Esau to go out into the field, hunt game, prepare a meal so that Isaac can bestow his blessing before his death. Rebekah hears this and commands Jacob in a way that subverts Isaac's own commands and conventional hierarchies. Jacob, the hairless son, wears skins to imitate his hairy brother. So touch and smell, not sight and hearing, function as Isaac's evidence for discerning between the two sons. Domesticated, not wild game, is to be eaten. The mother's command, not the father's, is followed, and the younger son, not the eldest, will receive the blessing. And this same upending of categories continues in the speech of the blessings themselves. Jacob is given the blessing that people will serve him, nations will bow down to him, and his own brothers will be subservient. Esau's blessing is the opposite of what he is deserving, given his position as the eldest. His dwelling place is away from the possibility of agricultural wealth. He is to live not in safety, but by the sword, and he is to serve his brother. So in this story of what has gone wrong, we can learn about how the biblical authors thought things ought to go if they go right. What is entailed in their notion of reliable transmission? So before I continue, I should ask, what do I mean by transmission? So usually the phenomenon of transmission is addressed in my area of study with respect to the question of literary and manuscript history. So that is, the concept of transmission is examined in as much as it can shed some light on how our texts came to their present form and what their reconstructed or imagined backstory can tell us. But what did the biblical authors themselves think about the movement of knowledge, speech, texts, objects, rights, and responsibilities? With this focus on textual or literary history, there are at least 2 aspects of transmission that remain unstudied or understudied in my field. So the first is what the transmission of written texts has to do with any other type of transmission. So what I mean here is not only a question about what the relationship of written texts and oral literature might be, but really beyond the literary history question to a phenomenological one. What is the relationship of texts and knowledge transmission to the movement of objects, rights, and responsibilities across generational lines? And this leads to what I see as a second sort of unstudied or understudied aspect of transmission in these literary cultures, which is, how do biblical and ancient Near Eastern scribes and authors conceptualize the passage of things, words, and ideas from one person to another? Can we identify and gather a set of values or images of how individuals are thought to relate to one another, how relationships, kinships, and generations are imagined in narratives, in instruction, and in law, which, by the way, are not also unframed law codes, but rather components of literary craft? So In this sense, the study of transmission covers not only or even not primarily literary history, but rather depictions of deathbed testament, inheritance, scribal principles, and transgenerational reward and punishment. A study of transmission is also concerned with the messages embedded in narratives and the literary techniques that are used to express them. So I'm planning on connecting this story of Isaac, Esau, Jacob, and Rebekah in Genesis 27 to Saul's loss of the kingship in 1 Samuel 15 and the Ugaritic tale of Akkad, which are 3 narrative episodes where transmission goes wrong. So why is this topic even important? A study of transmission can situate the topics of ancient literary history and production, scribalism, in a recovered ancient West Semitic phenomenology. So we can therefore speak about text production and literary techniques in the same breath that we speak of ancient metaphysical and social concepts. And at the most basic level, I'm actually interested in how biblical and ancient Near Eastern literary texts think about transgenerational relationships. How are objects, words, responsibilities, and privileges imagined to pass from one generation to the next? So in a few texts, I've discerned 2 ideas for the imagined proper function and dysfunction of intergenerational relations. So the first is the idea that truth entails obedience and preservation. Do not add, do not subtract, make no changes, and then knowledge can remain reliable. The second is related, if you think about it, which is an image that's often used for correct or incorrect behavior, following a straight self-same path or deviating on a crooked one. So the first transmission story I spoke of was the story of the subverted transmission of Patria Potestas from the patriarch Isaac to his firstborn son Esau in Genesis 27. And there's some interesting intersecting themes to be found here and with the Ugaritic tale of Akkad, in which mortal anxiety and succession are addressed through the unfolding of the story. The narrative presents father-to-son transmission of objects, authority, and personhood as a conventional path to success. It presents this conventional path of transmission and immortality in order to dismantle it, to offer an alternative through the female characters in the story. So the story opens with the crisis of Daniel's childlessness. Its resolution in the birth of his son Akkad foregrounds a more complex question, which is, can the father-son relationship traditionally conceived protect the father from his own mortality? So the first half of the story features a speech that's called the filial duties passage. This speech establishes the central tension in the story between the conventional expectations for human mortality and filial succession on the one hand, and unconventional possibilities for immortality and success on the other. And this speech assures the reader that a son's role is to mitigate the threat of the father's inevitable death by caring for the father in life, helping him make it home safely after a long night of drinking, bringing his offerings to the temple for him, taking care of him regularly, keeping his roof neatly rolled and his garment freshly cleaned. The son also takes care of the father in death, setting up a monument in perpetuity, performing rituals, presumably of remembrance in his honor, and protecting the father's reputation when the father's voice has ceased. So this list is a stylized set of responsibilities of a son, moving from singular performances, setting up a monument, to regular acts of devotion, cleaning the father's garment, all in the view of the expectation that the son will himself have a son to perform to ensure his own care. So in the story, the speech is given 4 times by 4 different characters. First by the god Baal in council with the god El, then by El in response to Baal's performance, and then by a messenger in the form of a birth announcement to Daniel announcing the birth of his son Akkad, and then finally by the father Daniel himself. And the speech itself in the story is transmitted perfectly from one character to the next, unchanged from performance to performance, spoken by authoritative male voices in the story. And the placement of this speech within the plot and its unbroken transmission from one character to the next formulates its own claim that the son is the guardian and ultimately the transmitter of the father's rights and responsibilities in life and death. So after the transmission of the blessing and the promises of a son, the story continues with Akkad coming of age. A divine bow is given to his father Daniel, who transmits this object to his son Akkad. Anat, the goddess, desires the bow and offers Akhat material success and even true immortality in exchange for it. Of course, Akhat refuses to relinquish the bow that his father had given him, and even sounds pretty rude doing it, saying something like, bows are of warriors, are womankind going to hunt now? So in the story, the dutiful son, Akhat, who refuses to give up his inherited bow, is set against this otherworldly, badly behaved goddess, Anat. But then we also have a human woman who suddenly appears in the story, Daniel's daughter and Akhat's sister, Purat, whose role appears to be as blood avenger. Akhat's rigidity to norms, hanging on to his bow for his dear life, is contrasted with his sister's unconventional behavior. And then the sort of mere existence of a son who just goes about doing his duties in a rote manner, this story seems to tell us, is actually not enough to ensure transgenerational survival, that actually some wisdom is necessary. And so in this story, one might say that unconventional transmission through a woman can provide the wisdom to keep the family line intact. And in this case, the father to son transmission, which is held up as an ideal, is only held up as an ideal so long as it can be achieved successfully. And then the sort of overarching question the story seems to pose is whether this kind of succession is possible without change from one generation to the next, or if new wisdom, like what the daughter offers, can assure succession. So transmission in the story is connected to a device that's used in its literary presentation, which is called command and fulfillment. So in this literary strategy, command and fulfillment, the reader observes complete word-for-word correspondence between instructions given from one character to the next. And this strategy is how the filial duties passage, that passage I showed you, is passed, identical and wholly intact from one character to the next. And we also find this strategy in the story in Genesis 27. And not just for time, I'm not going to bring you the examples here. You could just check it out later. So in this literary pattern, the speaker's commands are reported either by a narrator or by the obedient character as having been fulfilled without changes. And what's especially interesting is how this literary strategy stylistically manifests an idea that's at the heart of both of these stories, that stable transmission is that there should be stable transmission from one generation to the next. There's also a deeper concept which gives this literary pattern its force in the construction of these stories: the value for faithful correspondence of speech to action. In biblical literature, we encounter warnings to those reading or hearing instruction that they should maintain it intact as they had received it. They are commanded to neither add nor subtract from them. So for example, in Deuteronomy 4:2, the Israelites are told to preserve God's commandments as transmitted to them. Neither shall you add what I command you, nor shall you take from it. Similar statements are also found in ancient Near Eastern treaties and instructions with the same message. Those who encounter the words of the treaty or instruction may neither add nor subtract from them. These warnings are generally understood as statements on the completeness of instruction and its revelation to the scribe, even a sort of scribal principle of sorts. In a colophon, the scribe of a late Babylonian text reports receiving revelation of the words in a dream that, quote, he did not leave out a single line, nor did he add one to it. Ben Sira, too, in a praise of the completeness of God's wisdom, nothing added and nothing taken away, he has no need in his understanding. But when we encounter a version of this formula in Proverbs 30, we see that these statements are not limited to their concern for the fullness of God's revelation or even the fidelity of a text to its source. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you are discovered a liar. So speech abiding by this principle is true or authoritative in the sense the speech is reliable to its source. Adding to or subtracting from instruction renders a transmission unfaithful. These statements in their various formulation point to a shared notion of what is true or reliable, the faithful correspondence of speech to action, the correspondence of the terms of a command to its absolute fulfillment. So finally, the story of Saul's failure as king in 1 Samuel 15 is an example of action failing to correspond to speech. Because Saul did not fulfill what was commanded to him to the letter, Yahweh removes his favor. Samuel instructs Saul with Yahweh's command to attack Amalek and to destroy all that is there, sparing nothing: man, woman, child of any age, and domesticated animals of any kind. Saul only partially carries out these orders, sparing King Agag and the most valuable of the domesticated animals for sacrifice. This account is immediately followed by a resumption of the deity's communication to Samuel, who regrets making Saul king, quote, "For he has turned from me and did not uphold my words." Saul exemplifies the failure of instruction. It is a tale of what happens when command goes unfulfilled. A close reading of the episode shows a comedy of command and unfulfillment, which reaches its climax with Samuel telling Saul that, quote, "Obedience is better than any sacrifice, and paying attention to instruction is better than the fat of rams." This is a generalized principle. The fulfillment of instruction supersedes any other act of submission. In a hierarchy of behaviors, the Israelite deity prefers obedience to his commands over ad hoc gifts. Embedded within this statement and in its subsequent expression is the notion that hortatory speech, particularly divine instruction, demands acceptance by its hearers, which is why disobedience is characterized as an act of rejection. So put simply, Saul's authority over his people and their obedience to him depends on his own obedience to the Israelite deity. The chain of transmission of responsibility from one to another depends on the exact fulfillment of words to actions. A path set must be a path followed. So that's the end of my remarks, and I look forward to speaking more about it.
All right, thank you very much, Jacqueline. That was really interesting, and the idea of this fulfillment of the exact word and the the complete nature of the copying got me thinking about how when we get to a little later texts, Jubilees, and in the Quran we get the same thing, that they're saying like literally there is an actual copy in heaven that you could check it against, so we can actually know what the law, what these words are saying, but it just happens to be in heaven. So like we're being faithful to the copy up there, and that kind of gives us the legitimacy of the earthly version in a specific form. So that, I think it was really interesting, these ideas. But do you see how this idea of transmission and obedience and hierarchy, does this intersect with other genres and texts that you're working with?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is so striking is the way in which the presentation of instruction, right, as a father to a son, and the idea of like the whole drama of instruction, as well as like the student listening without responding, and accepting the words, that part of the acceptance of instruction is a performance of obedience, and accepting them without any changes in the interim. And so there is this kind of hierarchy, that the idea of reliable speech and transmission must sort of be patterned on to claim itself as authoritative. And what I think is kind of an interesting place for us to start exploring is the idea of, in such a literary culture with such a sort of like way of knowing how reliable any kind of knowledge is, how does one actually express in literary text subversion? Does one pattern their reception of knowledge in this sort of hierarchical way by other kind of by things that we might not sort of in a Western culture, where we think about knowledge being produced through dialogue of peers, right? That this is a different kind of model of the production of knowledge. And so all kinds of ways of expressing subversion would actually be part of this model, and we need not impose sort of our own sort of, I think it's probably this Greek inflected, dialectical idea of knowledge production onto the way knowledge is expressed in these cultures. So that, yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much again. This is really interesting, and thanks to all three of you. This has been really stimulating, and I think there are already a couple of questions, and now please, everyone, feel free to send questions through the Q&A, and I think Esther will field the questions now. So Esther, do you have something for us?
I do. So I start out with a question for Ellen. Jeremiah Coogan says, thank you so much for your fantastic paper. How do you think about the relationship between the man-centered model of dossier construction and the creation and reception of other kinds of dossiers in late antiquity, e.g. dossiers from the Donatist, Sicilianist controversy in North Africa, or Christological florilegia in Latin, Greek, Syriac, and other languages that don't center on a named figure for their coherence?
Oh, that's a good question, Jeremiah. I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm being asked a question to say something about the end of what Jackie said, just for a moment. And this is something that came up in Blossom's presentation also. Like, you could have alternately titled our panel "Do to Want to Live Forever." Like, all three are about how literary convention is set up to let a man via text surpass time, both, live beyond his own mortality, but also go back and forth in time. And the last question that Jackie asked, which is, can you be subversive in a literary culture? And can you be subversive in a text produced in a literary culture like that? My immediate thought was, no, you can't. Actually, you cannot work your way outside of that system. I want to revise that at some point, but I think just the way that convention and genre work, I mean, ultimately, these men are immortal. We are talking about them right now, and what they did worked. So I think that there's a way, you can't break the system that's set up to preserve you. So that was something that I just had that thought, and I wanted to pull together different presentations, but I'm also going to answer Jeremiah's question, which is, first off, that the presence of other kinds of dossiers or collections of text in late antiquity is an important and fascinating question, because they're not created by the person at their center. So in the case of the Donatist controversy, most of what I know is the collections of martyr stories that are put together to serve as evidence of the authenticity and the sort of superiority of Donatist Christianity to the other kind, Augustine's style of Christianity. And they don't center on a single person, but most of the texts themselves center on the story of one person. So it's almost like an anthology or an edited volume version. And I don't know how what I've put forward would intersect with the kind of organizing or compository principles of putting together something like that. Florilegia are a different story, though, because there is a single person at the center of all those. It's not the composer or the compiler, but so many of those pieces are pulled together to prove something about the person of Christ. And I'm using person there multiple times to make a point that when we say person of Christ, if we're talking about, historical theology, we're proving things about his essence, his nature, his over time, or his qualities over time, which are precisely the same kinds of things that late ancient evaluators of text use to say, oh, this is Cyril, or this isn't Cyril. This is John, and this isn't John. So sometimes we make a division between, historical theology over here, and then sort of, history of the literature over here, and the same concepts of what a person was and how a person's thoughts and words should cohere with our expectations of him or previous, demonstrations of that person. They're the engine of both of those ways of evaluating. So I have more to think about there, Jeremiah, but I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks. I think Jacqueline would also like to respond.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to, I think this is an awesome jumping off point that Ellen just brought up, this idea that in such a system, we cannot actually see subversion, or we can't see change. And I again sort of want to push back on that a little bit, just to say, the Western model values knowledge that emerges from competition between peers, right? Like Socratic dialogue, or criminal justice, or Hegelian or Marxian dialectics between thesis and antithesis that yield synthesis, right? But I think what I was trying to point out is that in the ancient Near Eastern context, legitimate knowledge looks different, right? It's hierarchical, it depends on notions of faithful obedience and exact imitation. But just because it is framed as such, it does not mean that the knowledge that is transmitted is actually faithful, right? So and this is sort of why I think that frames are so important, because frames kind of can serve in such a culture as a kind of gaslighting to the reader that that, okay, this is faithful obedience. This is, and this is actually precisely what happens in the story of Saul, of Saul's sort of failed obedience. He keeps trying to gaslight Samuel through this whole thing, saying, "Oh no, I was faithful. I did faithfully replicate all of the commands," while it's very clear he didn't. So I do think that. There is, I think it's just that it's subtle, right? And it's different from what we might expect of how innovation happens, and that we might need to shift our lens on how, both literary, how transmission is sort of presented, that frame of transmission is actually all so important, of, seeing, well, Deuteronomy claims that, it's faithful, but, we know that it's doing some really weird stuff that's pretty different from maybe other or previous law codes. So that's.
And just to add to that, I think and Liv Lead can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in Michael Penn's contribution to the Bible's Notepad volume, he writes about how Syriac scribes were trying to both give the actual correct copies of their opponents or of views they disagreed with, but then we're trying marginally to show, saying boo hiss about what they were commenting on. So they were actually subverting the dossier, if you will. They're saying this person said this, but we don't like it. So we have to let you know that this was part of the discussion theologically, but we want you to know that we really don't like it. And so there is also a tradition in these miscellaneous manuscripts or in these Phrygia that some scribes would actually comment on it and say, we want this to be part of the narrative, part of the remembered dossier, but we want you to know that from our perspective, it was just flat out wrong. So who else do we have out here? Esther, do you have a question for us?
I do. I have a question that sounds like it's mostly for Jackie, but could be for everyone. From Miko Huvia, asking, is there a pattern in biblical texts in the ways that women interfere in transmission? You mentioned Rebecca. Does she model subversion or challenging of patriarchal tradition, e.g. for Miriam, maybe Huldah? And if I can add on to that, I also think it's interesting the way that women interfere and contribute to transmission in the Akkad text that you discussed as well. So both the Bible and the Ugaritic stories would be interesting.
This is a fantastic question. I think it's a question actually for everyone on the panel, and including Esther, because Esther has also thought so much about this, and I've thought about this with Esther. I think that there's, a lot of, there's a desire out there to make the biblical texts acceptable for a kind of feminism that I am not sure is there. So that, when female characters are breaking norms in stories, sexual norms even, that they are ultimately in the service of upholding the patriarchy. So that I see this, a great example of this is the story of Tamar, obviously. But one place where it could be, and I don't want to call it feminist because that would be anachronistic, but to say that a different lineage is being installed is in the Book of Ruth. And I see that the Book of Ruth is sort of like almost deliberately erasing men from the very beginning of the story, and then putting men in service of what will be a sort of almost like a matriarchal line, that like the child's going to be a child born to Naomi in the end, and who even knows what happened to Elimelech? That guy's gone now. No one cares about him at the end. Okay, maybe Boaz. Who knows? Who knows what what the provenance of that genealogy at the end is? But it seems like it's really not even in service of sort of the thinking subject in the story is not Boaz, right? Maybe it's Naomi, and so I think that's something to think with there.
Thank you. Eleanor Blossom, do you want to respond to either Jackie's comment or the question in general?
Esther, I was thinking maybe you could add something to that, because I know you're working on this kind of thing right now. So would you just elaborate just a bit?
Sure. Well, I have more questions than answers is the problem. So but I have a lot of questions. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting as a parallel between the two stories that Jackie pointed out of Akkad and Genesis was that in both stories, the masculine first son is ends up not being the inheritor so much as a kind of genderqueer figure, because you have on the one hand Pugat, who dresses up in men's clothes in order to achieve her vengeance, although unfortunately the text is broken, so we don't see exactly how that plays out. And on the other hand, you have Jacob, who is hairless and smooth and domestic and herds animals rather than going out and hunting. And so it's surprising in both cases that they're the ones who seem to be continuing the father's inheritance, that patrilineage, in a way. And so I'm being put on the spot. I'm not entirely sure what to do with that parallel there, but I do think that it says some interesting things about maybe questioning the assumed way that texts should be or are transmitted.
Great, thanks. Let's see, I think there might be another question out there.
Yeah. So there's a great question by Jennifer Berry, who asks, I'm currently working on Women and Ancient Dreams to think about the transmission of knowledge that escapes male violence and attempts to silence female voices. Are there ways to connect these broader questions about the transmission of authoritative knowledge and gender, specifically how the female voice is preserved despite it all? Are there ways to get around male authoritative knowledge? And I think that's a question really for anyone on the panel.
Yeah, I can, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I think that is a question which makes very stark demands of us as scholars, because Jackie mentioned, receiving knowledge by being obedient and consistent and staying in the same line. Well, that's a relationship with the religious past that we as scholars are invited to take up, right? We are invited to sort of preserve and match with these fathers and so on. And so if we want to be able to look at women's knowledge in these texts or in late antiquity or what have you, we do have to make methodological innovations to get around that. And that is extremely challenging. We have in this project, in the Books Known Only by Title project, we have seen some pattern of association. This relates to Rebecca Solveig's work. Association of kind of bad knowledge with women. So there is sort of a usage of women for the overall Moving Knowledge project, but it's very tricky to try to find out how women were moving their own knowledge. And I have doubts about whether any of that has come down to us or how to deal with it. But this is also, this is a gap in the archive, right? This is a silence in the archive. And there's a lot of excellent thinking coming out of Black diaspora studies, post-colonial studies, and so on, which is developing methods and experimenting with methods to deal with that, I can point there to the work of Saidiya Hartman, and I have it on my desk here. Jenny Sharp would be, two people among many who are trying to figure that out at this point.
Does somebody else want to hop in at this point? Jacqueline or Ellen?
I just want to say, if you're a person in the audience who's interested in one of those thinkers that Blossom just talked about, what you're going to want to Google is an article called Venus in Two Acts. And I think actually Jenny Berry might have been the first person to recommend that article to me. So it's fun to watch it come back around as a answer to her question. But I think, no, it's a fantastic answer, because those Saidiya Hartman and other women working with scant archives are attempting to represent people that what's interesting about their case versus our case, or at least in my case, I'll talk about this. So attempting to represent subjects to whom they have an ethical and moral tie. And what's different for me is that I don't have an ethical or moral tie to the people that I study. I don't claim them as my own. I'm not part of the tradition. I'm interested in them in part, frankly, because that's what you do when you learn a bunch of ancient languages, and that's what learning a bunch of ancient languages you to do. So I'm a tool that's really fit for only like 2 or 3 jobs, and this is one of them. So the question I think I'd pose back to Jenny is, what ethical or moral tie do you have to the women you want to write about? Because I think if you have one, and it doesn't have to be a religious one, it can simply be a tie of solidarity. If you have one, and if you articulate it, then I think that makes much clearer for you, and possibly for your readers, if you're presenting that in an introduction, what kind of imaginative recovery you can do, and what the limits of that might be, not just for you where you would stop, but also where your readers might get off and say, it's too imaginative or fabulous for me. So I think there's a difference between people who are doing contemporary, and by contemporary I mean laughably like the last 100 years, contemporary historical work and ancient historical work, and what our relationship with that past is.
Great. I guess, is there another question? We can take one more maybe before we wrap up if it's quick. Esther?
Yeah, there are a couple more questions, and I apologize to those whose questions are not going to get answered then. But there's a question to Jackie from Ehud Ben Tzvi. Would you be willing to consider references to precise transmissions as a means to actually subvert existing positions?
That's a tricky question. I think that what I would say is that the statement that something is precise or accurate, or again, it's really in the formula of do not add, do not subtract, because it is this idea of the transmission of speech or ideas or responsibilities akin to an object, and the transmission of an object is fully intact. That it's, that kind of statement is used to express its reliability, and that, whether or not there is something, beneath that might be, not necessarily the case, or, might be sort of subtly subverting an existing position, I think, depends on the other kind of hints that are given throughout. You'd have to determine whether, you have a rebellious a rebellious trait or not, so yeah.
Great. Well, I think that, Ellen, there's a question for you, but I wonder if I can see that you're typing an answer to it already. So if you just want to, would you like to answer this question quickly, or do you just want to go ahead and just send your answer in writing?
Because it's almost 2:15 and that's what we
Yep.
promised people, I don't want to take up too much time,
Okay.
but thank you.
Yeah, great. So then, as it is now, I guess it's 2:15 somewhere. It's 8:15 in Oslo, and so as our time is drawing close, just as a ship approaches the harbor, and we have to then prepare to disembark. So again, I want to thank our panelists for their excellent presentations and for this great discussion. We are really grateful that you all came and contributed to this event. And thank you all also for watching and participating. So our next event in the Books Known Only by Title project will be a webinar again on Wednesday, the 13th of January. And this one will be on esoteric knowledge. So please check out the link in the chat that Esther has posted that is for our project webpage. And there you'll see the list of webinars that we will be hosting through the Books Known Only by Title project throughout the spring. And also you can check out other bits about the project there. The registration link isn't up just yet, but it will be coming eventually. So check back, and there is a lot of exciting things happening. So please check back for more of that. Again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And I wish you all a good afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for being here. Bye.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing.